Hello, readers! Welcome back to Reading in the Middle, the podcast where we celebrate the magic of middle grade books. I'm your host, Annisha Jeffries, Youth Services Manager at the Cleveland Public Library. And today, I'm thrilled to be interviewing Jessica Vitalis, an award-winning author whose books bring depth, heart, and imagination to middle grade readers. I'll be talking to Jessica about her latest novel, Unsinkable Cayenne, a lyrical, heartfelt story set in 1985 Montana, where Cayenne, a girl who spent her life on the move, finally has a chance to put down her roots. But the school struggles, family challenges, and a Titanic-themed project that forces her to rethink everything as she begins to wonder, what if being normal isn't what she really needs? Jessica is no stranger to crafting unforgettable stories. She's the author of The Wolf's Curse, The Rabbit's Gift, and Coyote Queen, all of which have received high praise and literary honors. A Junior Library Guild Gold Standard author and Canadian Council for the Arts Grant recipient, she has been featured on CBC's Here and Now, The Morning Edition, and CTV's Your Morning. Jessica holds dual American and Canadian citizenship and currently lives in Ontario, Canada, with her husband and 2 daughters. In today's episode, we'll dive into how music helps Cayenne find her voice, the surprising parallels between the Titanic and middle school, the challenges of settling down after life on the road, family friendships, and why middle school can feel like a sinking ship. Jessica's stories resonate with readers of all ages, and I know you're going to love hearing about her journey and Unsinkable Cayenne. So, grab your favorite reading spot. This is Reading in the Middle. Hi, Jessica. How are you?
Hi, Annisha. I am fantastic and thrilled to be here talking books with you tonight.
Thank you. I'm just so excited to get this interview started because I have so many questions. And I know that, you are a wonderful writer, and your books, they have so many great themes like identity, resilience, grief, belonging, but you make them feel so accessible to middle grade readers. How do you balance writing about complex topics in a way that truly resonates with young readers?
Wow, that is a really big question. First of all, thank you. I appreciate those accolades and sentiments about my work. I have a mission to write books that are going to resonate and entertain readers, but ask them really thought-provoking questions about themselves and their lives. And it took me a really long time to figure out how to find that balance of stories that kids would really be interested in reading that still are sort of meaty, and there's a lot to unpack. And I really had a breakthrough. It was maybe, I'm going to say 7 years into my writing game. By the way, it took me 13 years to get my first publishing deal. So this was a hard one, hard fought lesson. But I remember I had the privilege of sharing a chapter of one of my manuscripts with Chris Grabenstein, the author of Mr. Lemoncello's Library. Did I get the title right? Lemoncello's Library. He's a fantastic author, and he was gracious enough to read my first chapter. And he sent me some feedback saying, our mission has to be entertain readers. Now, he writes a completely different kind of story. He writes really humorous capers. But when I looked at my story through that lens, I realized that it was really boring. I was just talking to the readers. And so I think for me, the focus always has to be on captivating the reader, having them fall in love with character. And once you introduce a character that feels real and meaningful, then I think readers are really able to go along for the ride and are really able to delve into some really realistic and meaningful subjects.
That's awesome because I fell in love with Cayenne. And your new book is The Unsinkable Cayenne. And could you just tell our listeners a little bit about The Unsinkable Cayenne?
Sure. Unsinkable Cayenne is about a young girl who has spent her entire life traveling the country in this weird sticker covered van with her strange hippie parents. And what she really wants to do is settle down and she wants a chance for a normal life. And so they end up welcoming twins to the family, Bear and Saucity. And her parents finally realize maybe this lifestyle is not sustainable with twin infants. So they do finally settle down in a very small town in a rural area in Montana. And Cayenne thinks this is it. This is her chance to finally make friends, to fit in, to build a normal life. And of course, she discovers that simply staying in one place does not mean that you are going to have all of the acceptance that you want. And eventually, she has to figure out if that's something that's really even worth fighting for.
Yeah, so what drew you to write about a character who's never had a real home and is searching for belonging?
Well, that's a topic very near and dear to me because I lived a really transient childhood. My family moved almost 24 times before I reached fourth grade. So I never lived in a sticker covered van, but we lived in a school bus. We lived in a camper that we pulled behind our car. We lived in a one-room cabin with no electricity or running water. So I was Cayenne. I was that kid who longed for a home, who longed for a chance to find a place that she belonged.
But you didn't have the sticker covered van, so Leave a Hoot Don't Pollute. You didn't have that.
It was entirely my imagination.
Oh, well, I love the fact, I adore the fact that this book is set in the 1980s, 1985 to be exact. I was around, I remember, I was in middle grade school when, in 1985. And oh my goodness, that's 40 years ago. I just thought about that.
You know what's going to shock your listeners is when I promote this book, I have to refer to it as historical fiction, which I know is horrifying for you and me who grew up in that time.
Oh,
But for middle grade readers, this is ancient history. Like it really is historical fiction. I know I can
you're
see
absolutely right.
it's breaking.
You're right. I never thought about that. Historical fiction is like eons long, real old, old. I'm not old. I'm young. But yes, what inspired you to choose that era, and um, did you include any fun 80s elements for readers to discover?
Yeah, this story was always going to be set in the 80s simply because it was inspired by an incident from my childhood in the 80s when I was out walking my dog and I developed a crush on a really cute young boy walking down the street. And so as I wrote the story, it was always set in the 80s. But I knew before I sent it to my publisher, sort of traditional wisdom holds that in order for a book to be historical, it has to have a historical anchor, something to make sure that it's tied to that particular time and place. Otherwise, there's no reason why the book shouldn't just be contemporary. I could have a crush now, walking down the street. So I sat down at my computer and I started Googling like what was going on in the 80s. Because my family was so transient, I was not plugged into current events. I was not plugged into politics. I was not plugged into anything really other than my little family environment. And one of the very first things that came up for me was the Titanic. And it was actually discovered in life after having been missing for 72, 73 years. Nobody knew where the wreckage was. And because I knew that I was writing about socioeconomics and sort of Cayenne's feeling of being inferior or feeling that she was inferior because her family was different and didn't have a lot of money. And I started to think about the social dynamics on board the Titanic and how the first class lived such very different lives from the third class and
Mhm.
how they died differently. It just felt like the absolutely perfect anchor for my story. So, yeah, that's sort of how and why it ended up in the 1980s and how I tied the Titanic into the story.
I really enjoyed that part as well because, um, you know, with talking about the Titanic, um, Cayenne sees her own struggles reflected in the ship's class system. Were I know you mentioned that you brought in a Titanic, but were you always fascinated by the Titanic when you found out about that? Um, and how did that connection come to you while writing the story? I know you mentioned um, that that was the only anchor that you had, growing up. But when you began writing the story, did you do more research about the Titanic? And I know you mentioned something in the author's note as well about the Titanic because some information was totally different, and they had that Encyclopedia Titanica. I'm probably answering all your questions already.
Oh, there's so much to sink your teeth into there because the Titanic is such a cultural phenomenon, right? Like you mentioned the
Hmm.
Titanic. Even when I go visit classes, kids as young as fourth grade, I'll ask, how many of you have watched the Titanic? And I'm always shocked by how many kids raise their hands because to me, that's a love story. I mean, it is a love story with some really steamy scenes, but
Hmm.
it's just pervasive in our culture. Like everybody knows the story of the Titanic. So when I sat down to Google it, really the only thing I knew about the Titanic was based on James Cameron's movie. And it turns out that's okay because the movie is actually, despite the fact that the actual love story is fictional, almost everything else in the movie is factual. So thankfully that turned out to be the case. But the very minute I Googled and saw the Titanic, instantly I could see the parallels between Cayenne and the social divisions on the Titanic. And so I did do a lot of research, reading about different passengers, trying to choose sort of which passengers I was going to bring to life for Cayenne.
Yes.
So definitely a lot of research went into it, but it was very clear to me from the very beginning exactly how I was going to make those contrasts. And for the people listening, Cayenne ends up having a teacher who's obsessed with the Titanic. And so she ends up having to learn about passengers on board the ship. And that's how she starts to make some of these connections between how the first class passengers lived, how the third class passengers were treated. And then as the story goes on, she starts to make some of those same connections to her own life.
Yes, there was the whole social class system with that and her trying to find friends, going to a new school and just trying to fit in and just make her mark because, she's been moving around. Middle school can actually feel like the Titanic. There's always a social hierarchy and sometimes you feel like you're sinking. What's your best advice for kids who don't quite belong?
Well, I hope that after kids read this book, they will understand that belonging is, in a sense, particularly in middle school, overrated because there is an incentive to normalize, to fit in, to be like everybody else. And I think that's changing. I see in my kids now that modern kids are starting to prioritize their individuality more and more, but still this sense that you really need to conform is pervasive in middle school. And so my message to young kids is to embrace your individuality, love who you are, love your differences, because that's really what makes you special.
I agree. Thank you for mentioning that because I think, by us growing up in the 1980s, um, if I had known, because I used to like collecting stickers and things like that, if I had known there were other young people out there that were doing the same thing, I would have felt like this connection because I was the only one doing that. Um, but I think with the way the world is now, young people can see that they're not alone liking certain things and uh, being um, able to uh, connect easily with others if it's not in school, but it may be socially, like online, in a positive way. In a positive way, I just want to say that. But yes, I'm not going to answer your question. You answered it for me in a great way. So, but yes, because Cayenne, she deals with so many different friendships. Like you mentioned, her first crush, middle school drama is a factor in this as well. It was making me kind of tense up, thinking about it in the past. But it's not about me, it's not about me. But what I'm saying is that it was so relatable. That's what I'm saying. Your book really is just relatable. Um, and I think your readers will find this uh just remarkable to read, and also they'll be able to understand, it, although it's historical, they can still understand what's going on. It doesn't have to be 2005, 2015. It's, you know,
In a lot about this fact that this story is set in 1985, but these issues we're talking about, they are universal and they are ongoing. We all know what it feels like to feel disconnected, to feel other, to feel somehow like some aspect of our identity, whether it's our embarrassing parents or our faith or anything about us. We all find reasons to believe that we are the only ones going through this struggle, when in fact, feeling like you don't belong is a universal aspect of growing up.
and so what was it like writing those moments? How did you when you were writing them, how did you feel? What was it like going through that process? Did you have to relive a lot of things like when you were growing up? Did your children, I don't know how old they are, but did you take anything away from like, when your children are like going to school, that type of thing?
Yeah, so this book comes on the heels of my previous book, Coyote Queen, which was also inspired by my childhood, and it sort of followed a different aspect of my childhood. But pairing these two together was sort of like just ripping off the Band-Aid and really delving back into my childhood. And so it took a lot of introspection and a lot of writing and a lot of rewriting to figure out. Part of it was a little bit like therapy, because there was some stuff that I needed to write out because I needed to get it on paper, and then realized
Mm-hmm.
after the fact that maybe those events weren't serving the story that I needed to tell. Those events were important to Jessica, but they didn't need to be a part of Cayenne's journey. So it was a really interesting experience weaving in my own childhood experiences. But at the end of the day, I always tried to step back and figure out, you know, while I was writing from lived experience, at the end of the day, it was Cayenne's story that I wanted to tell.
Ah, very nice, very nice. Also, in the Unsinkable Cayenne, um, Cayenne's dad, he struggles with PTSD. Um, and for our listeners, that's post-traumatic stress disorder. Um, why why is it important to include that in his story, part of his story and his struggles?
So I wanted to do something to give the parents some depth and interest for the readers, because so often we as writers just try to cut the parents out. Um, But I didn't want him to just be this cookie cutter, "Oh, dad's a hippie." And because of the time frame I was writing, and it made sense that he is a Vietnam vet, at the same
Hmm.
time, I didn't want to make this experience all about his trauma and his recovery. So I tried to find that balance where we could see that some of his PTSD was impacting Cayenne and certainly had an impact on the lifestyle they lived and the choices they were making. Um,
Hmm.
but at the same time, I did not want to send the message to the reader that his traumas were Cayenne's to solve, because this story needed to be really centered on her and her journey, while at the same time acknowledging that young readers often have very complicated family situations that they really can't
Yes.
fix.
What made you decide to write the story in verse?
So, novels in verse sort of exploded on the scene several years ago. And I remember very distinctly when they really started becoming popular. I remember reading like Jasmine Warga's stories and some of the other stories that were becoming popular. And I told a critique partner, these books are so beautiful and I could never write one. I just have no idea how they do it. So that was always sort of in the back of my mind, anchored that I'm not a poet. I don't identify as a poet. But at the same time, I had this longing like, wow, they're so beautiful. Wouldn't it be cool to try? And when I came up with the idea for this story, it was originally going to be a short story for an anthology. And it came out in verse, specifically in free verse. So for your listeners, that means that it's not rhyming poetry. It's just using very sparse sentences and playing with the shape of the words on the page to convey a deeper emotional meaning than normal prose, where you just have line after line after line of sentences. And so I think writing a short story felt really safe, right? It was like, okay, if
Right.
this work, if my critique partners don't like it, if my agent doesn't like it, I'll just rewrite my short story. Not a lot of skin off my nose, doesn't take a lot of time. Well, they loved it. And so I was shocked by that. And my agent sent it off to my editor as part of this anthology submission. And my editor wasn't interested in an anthology, but she said, if Jessica wants to turn that short story into a novel, I would be really interested. So all of a sudden, the girl who is not a poet ended up writing a novel in verse.
I love that. And a novel in verse, uh, you really are into the story. It goes by, for me, it feels like it's going by very fast, but you are able to absorb those characters. You're able to really get the dialogue. And I think it's brilliant. I've, for once, loved reading your book, and I contacted you. I said I have to speak with you because you had it's it really really touched me, and I really appreciated your writing. It's very strong, and it's very um it's key moments where your readers will really be able to think about those characters long after they finished reading your book.
Oh, thank you so much
Um,
for saying that. I really appreciate it.
oh, I'm still thinking about them as well, and I don't want to spoil anything because um, there's I don't want to say too much, but what I will say is there's a lot of bird watching. So Cayenne mentions birds a lot in the book. So that's always nice, right? um, and also, there's part where you Cayenne loves playing the flute. And that's something else that you've incorporated in the story that, she plays an instrument and she wants to belong. And so, did you play a musical instrument?
Like Cayenne, I also played the flute. And I remember very distinctly in fourth grade when the band instructor brought out all of the instruments. And I saw that all the popular girls at the school I was living at the time all chose the flute. And so my decision was, partly based on, oh, what beautiful music, what a beautiful instrument, but also that sense of wanting to belong, much like Cayenne. So that's another piece of the story that came very much from the heart for. But I did want to say, when you're talking about the friendships, there's some characters in the story, like there's a girl Tiff who readers aren't going to like very much. But at the same time, I want her to be realistic. We all know that there are middle schoolers who aren't always operating from a place of kindness. But I didn't want to portray her as just this terrible, awful kid because I don't really think there are terrible, awful kids. There are kids who are dealing with their own set of circumstances and problems. And sometimes that influences who they become as people and how they show up in the world. So, I hope that even though you don't necessarily like all of the characters, maybe you'll feel some empathy for all of the characters in the story.
I agree because that's true. That's how life is. That's what's honest about your book. You're going to have people in your life at school that may not be nice to you, may not want you to belong, but that doesn't mean necessarily that, that's who they are um, as a person. And so you're right with Tiff. I know that there was this part in the story where all the girls had perms, and she had, she didn't have a perm, but she made sure she had the tight curls. She did one of those where wrap your hair in with paper and wet it. And when she went to school, they thought she had a perm, but she was like, I'm not gonna tell them that it's not. But you fit in, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yes.
that's true to life. That's what we as humans do. And it's certainly what kids do, is look for any way they can to conform to whatever their peers are doing.
And there's one part in the story too where, I'm not gonna spoil it, but Cayenne wanted some shoes and she wasn't able to get them. And there was an opportunity for her to get them. Whether it was right or wrong, Cayenne makes a decision in order to belong, but she has a discussion with her mom. And I want to know, like, were you torn, to actually have Cayenne make that decision of whether or not she wanted to take a little bit in the white envelope?
I don't think that I was ever torn about that, because I was always very clear from the beginning that Cayenne is a flawed human being. She is a
Hmm.
real person. She is a real character in the story. And so I never wanted to portray her as somebody who goes through life making all of the right decisions, because none of us do that. We all have so many things. I know all of us have things that we would go back and change and things that we would regret. And I certainly do. And so I wanted to make sure that that was part of the story, that she was this realistic kid who doesn't always make the right decision, and who sometimes can justify doing things that she knows probably aren't the best things to do. But at the same time, I didn't want her to be in a situation where these things were ruining her life. And so I think that was the trickier part, is knowing where the balance was, is making sure that you'd see that there are consequences for the decisions you make. So that was probably trickier than deciding whether she was going to make these bad decisions or
I like that. Okay, thank you. Because
not.
Jessica, I have a question for you. If all of your animal characters like wolf, rabbit, coyote, Saint Bernard went on a road trip together, who would be the leader? And who would get everyone lost?
Who would be the leader? Okay. So in my first book, The Wolf's Curse, the wolf is an invisible great white wolf who is actually death. So it turns out that she is death, but she has a much deeper backstory. So she would absolutely be the leader of any road trip that any of these characters went on. And if anybody was going to get anybody in trouble, it would absolutely be Quincy Rabbit from The Rabbit's Gift, which is my second book, because Quincy is this little runt who lives with his family in the Warren, and he desperately wants to be one of the big, strong rabbits that can leave the Warren, but he's just this tiny little pipsqueak. And so he ends up sneaking out and causing all sorts of trouble. So those two together would be probably my choices.
Oh, nice, nice. And oh, I forgot to mention you have animals. There were chickens. There are chickens in Unsinkable Cayenne, right? George the Saint Bernard. So I mean, those chickens were in there. They didn't have any names, not that I recall. Um, but there were chickens. I don't understand too why the girls, when they came to visit Cayenne, they were like, "You have chickens? That would be cool." I would think that would be cool.
Well, I think when you come from a place of being embarrassed by your parents, everything they do is embarrassing, right? So Cayenne is
Mm.
already thinks her parents are the most embarrassing parents in the world. She also has chickens in the front yard. So, for her, that's just more evidence that her parents are embarrassing. And I think her friends judge, there are so many other things that they're taking into consideration, not just the chickens in the front yard, but this house that you mentioned with no doors and the weird sticker covered van and dad doing some questionable things. I mean, maybe she
Mm-hmm.
lived in this big, beautiful house and had this embellished, beautiful chicken coop in the front yard. Maybe that would be different, but that's not what they saw when they arrived at the house.
That's true. You're right. Okay, Jessica, here we go. This is new for Reading in the Middle,
Okay.
and you're the first author to be a part of this.
Boy,
It's
now I'm
called, yes, you're the first.
okay.
This is called Reading in the Middle Lightning Round.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to be asking you some questions. Don't overthink it, but you just got to pick one.
Okay.
Okay, are you ready?
Ready.
Okay, here we go. Big fluffy dog or tiny lap dog?
A cat.
No, that's fine. No, writing at night or early morning?
Early morning.
Titanic history or the movie?
Titanic history.
Road trip adventure or cozy hometown?
Road trip adventure all the way.
Your dream bookish superpower?
Oh, well, of course it would be to just sit down and pound out a first draft that was absolutely polished and ready to go.
80 movies or modern day movies?
Modern day movies.
Okay, that's it for our lightning round. Thank you.
Additional.
Yes. I would have selected cats too. So yeah.
I'm a dog, and we have two cats, but I'm more of a cat lady if I have to be honest.
So your books always explore big emotions and themes. What do you hope readers take away from Unsinkable Cayenne?
I really hope they come away thinking about how they judge themselves, the value of their worth, and the value of the humans around us.
Can you give us a sneak peek of what you're working on next? Any hints?
Well, I actually have several things in the works. I am working on a couple more middle grade novels, and I'm also working on a novel for adult readers. But I actually put out 4 books in 4 years. So I am taking a
Wow.
little bit of a breather and haven't submitted anything to my publisher yet, just because I needed to take a deep breath. And so it'll be a while before any announcements are made, but I definitely have a lot in the works that I'm excited to share down the road.
Oh my gosh, I'm excited. Listeners, I know you're excited as well. And pick up all of Jessica's books, all of her books, especially her newest one, Unsinkable Cayenne, because you are in for a treat. And Jessica, this has been so much fun. I've had such a great time. I want to thank you for hanging out with me on Reading in the Middle. Um, but before you go, where can listeners find you and keep up with your books?
The very best place to find me at this point is at jessicavitalis.com. And my books are available everywhere books are sold.
Oh, also libraries too.
And libraries for sure. Yes. And by the way, if they're not in your library, go ahead and request them, because very often librarians will order books that are requested. So don't give up if you don't see them right away on the shelves.
Oh, definitely. And I've been recommending your books because I work at a library. So
Yeah.
most definitely. Oh, yes, 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 yes. So Jessica, I want to thank you again. And also, listeners, don't forget to check out The Unsinkable Cayenne, The Wolf's Curse, The Rabbit's Gift, and Coyote Queen. You're going to be in for a very great treat and a great read.
Oh, thank
I
you.
want to
So
thank you, Jessica.
appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great evening.
You too. And that wraps up another episode of Reading in the Middle. A huge thank you to Jessica Vitalis for joining us today and sharing the inspiration behind Unsinkable Cayenne. Her ability to weave powerful emotions into her stories is truly remarkable, and I know this book will resonate with so many readers. If you haven't already, be sure to check out Unsinkable Cayenne and Jessica's other incredible books like The Wolf's Curse, The Rabbit's Gift, and Coyote Queen. You can find her online at jessicavitalis.com and on social media, where she shares her insights into her writing journey and upcoming projects. As always, thank you for tuning in and supporting Reading in the Middle. If you have enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps other book lovers find us. And if you have a favorite middle grade author you'd love to hear on the show, let me know. Until next time, keep reading, keep dreaming, and keep embracing the magic of middle grade books.